We are happy to welcome to our studios Wilfried von Bredow. He is Professor Emeritus of Political Science at Philipps University in Marburg, Germany, and a visiting professor at the University of Toronto's Munk School for this semester. Welcome to Canada. It's nice to meet you.
Thank you.
I must confess we don't, every day of the week on this program, talk about German defense policy. So, to that end, I'm going to read a short paragraph here from the Atlantic Partnership publication that was published last fall, just to set the table for our conversation. Declining defense budgets coupled with increasing expeditionary demands on Bundeswehr forces around the world underline the case for fundamental reform. In essence, the proposed reforms center on two core issues. First, at the quantitative level, how many active soldiers should the Bundeswehr have in the future? And second, at the qualitative level, what should be the armed forces composition in terms of professional soldiers, volunteer personnel, as well as drafted conscripts? Okay, let's pull this apart a little bit if we can. What, as you understand them, are the specific reforms being proposed now?
Well, I think the most important reform in this package is the abolition of conscription, which was a cornerstone of Germany's military and security policy since the Bundeswehr was founded in 1955. But in fact, conscription after the end of the East-West conflict, in this new security landscape with new threats and risks and dangers, with new missions for the military, is kind of obsolete today.
And why are they making the recommendation to abolish conscription now?
Well, they should have made it earlier, I think, but it took the German public, the politicians, and the military leadership about 20 years, from 1990 to today, to recognize that indeed there must be a reform going on, and this reform must be fundamental and substantial. You know, it's like if you start a marathon and you start with very small steps, you won't go very far in short time. So now this is a big step. And I think the most important reason for this big step is the Afghanistan shock, the experience of Germany in Afghanistan, where the Bundeswehr found out that it's not enough to be a kind of organization that is only protecting civil projects, that is a kind of social worker organization with arms, but that they have to fight. And this kind of asymmetric warfare is something that the Bundeswehr does not know very well until now and has to learn. And that's one of the main goals of the reform.
It's always a tough balancing act in Germany, isn't it? Whether the forces should be, very strictly peacekeeping and do, as you call it, social work, or be a war-fighting machine. Is that right?
Yes, it is. It is because the politicians and the public since 1955 have always considered the Bundeswehr as a kind of, not really peacekeeping force, but a force to defend the territory in a quite unplausible scenario, I would think, in the East-West conflict, and to be part of the Western deterrence posture. But this has changed. Deterrence is gone. There is no territorial threat to the German countryside. From the east, we are surrounded by friends, has one defense minister told the public, and therefore the Bundeswehr has to redefine itself.
So why do you think, Wilfried, it's taken, as you said earlier, 2 decades to get out of this kind of Cold War mentality?
Well, in hindsight, of course, it's always easy to say it should have been much quicker. The problem is that, indeed, after 1945, and when the new democratic society and state in Germany were founded, the old perspective of and perception of the military was really washed out of the collective mentality of the Germans. So there is no more Prussian militarism. The Nazi defeat was so comprehensive that indeed Germany has become a kind of a military, civil oriented society, sometimes even a pacifist society. And therefore, there are very few people who really are dealing with security policy, and the public discourse is not really very educated in matters of security. And that's, of course, a situation where it's difficult for politicians to do something because you won't gain good points in emphasizing security policy matters.
Let me read another excerpt, if I can, this one from the Christian Science Monitor from January of this year. It says, quietly at first, but less so now, Germany is breaking out of its post-war identity, the assumptions and understandings that held it in place for 60 years. Germany is shedding the past, busting old taboos, and being more assertive. How is, admittedly, all these years later, how is World War II still influencing the current debate over military reform in Germany?
Oh, it is very much influencing the current debate, and it will not go away. And I think the remembrance of what happened in the Nazi period and the years after 1945 with all this misery are a very important part of the political culture in Germany. And it's not a generational thing. It will stay with us, I think, for the next generations to come. But then you have, on the other side, mounting expectations by other organizations worldwide. The United Nations always asks the Germans to contribute not only money, but also, in certain peace missions, soldiers.
And how much support is there for that in Germany, among the public?
There is support as long as these missions are not really military missions. So supervision of democratic elections, like in Congo, or helping to protect NGOs, distributing food to refugees, that's something which is, I think, in very high esteem, as is the organization of the Bundeswehr as a whole. So there is no enmity against the soldiers. But in the moment, the soldiers are in missions which are really war or warlike missions. Mm-hmm. Then the public immediately turns around and, for instance, just now, I think more than 2/3 of the German public is strictly in favor of the Germans going out of Afghanistan as quickly as possible.
In other words, yesterday, they'd like to be gone.
Yeah, yeah. It's a little bit like in Canada, as this is concerned.
You pointed out earlier that there is going to be a change coming forward in terms of military conscription. What's the timeline on that?
Well, I think the experts are not really sure how quickly it can come into this new shape. The Bundeswehr is losing about 1/4 of its volume. So it's going down from 245 to 185,000 soldiers. Mm-hmm. There is a huge bureaucratic reform, which is very important. Conscription itself is already abolished. So since the last crew of draftees went in January for 6 months, and that's it. So from July on, we have an all-volunteer armed force.
Of course, one of the things in this country that the military people tell us is a constant problem is recruitment. It's very difficult when it's not conscription army, when it's a volunteer army, to get people to volunteer. Is that going to be the case in Germany as well?
Well, nobody really knows, because until now, the proportion of conscripts within the military was already rather low. So we had about 60,000 conscripts in the armed forces. Now, the armed forces volume going down mean that we need, of course, the same kind of recruitment going on for professional soldiers and soldiers who go into the military for 4 to 12 years. And this is a question of, well, money, of course. The new armed forces will not be less expensive than the current armed forces. And it's also dependent from all kinds of economic factors in the civil environment, of course.
Okay. Do you know Jeffrey Kopstein? You know, he's at the Monk School as well, the professor?
I know him well, yes.
Okay, I figured you did, because I want to play a clip of him. He was a guest on this program. This is from a couple of years ago, and we talked about some of the issues that we're dealing with today. And here's what he had to say. Michael, if you would, roll the tape, please.
I mean, in most countries, the problem is body bags of the soldiers coming home, the fallen nationals, fallen Canadians, fallen Americans. In the case of Germany, the problem isn't so much German soldiers dying. It's, as you say, Germans can't be seen to be killing anyone.
How much of that is still a problem for the German military? People remember World War II, and nobody wants to see German soldiers killing anybody else around the world today.
Well, until very recently, for instance, the mandate of the Bundestag in Afghanistan, as in other places, was shaped in a way that indeed German soldiers could evade this problem. But this has changed, and that's what I call the Afghanistan shock. And that was in September 2009, when a German colonel ordered close air support by Americans because two tank trucks had been bogged by the Taliban fighters, and they were on a sandbank in the Kunduz River, and they couldn't go further. And in that night, he ordered the military to drop some bombs, and so about 100 people were killed, Taliban fighters, but also civilians who just wanted to get some part of the loot. And that was a real uproar in Germany. And I think this was the event that really changed the public perception. The Germans cannot function, the German military cannot function otherwise than all other militaries. So they have to do their job, and their job is sometimes very difficult because not only other soldiers, but also civilians are going to die.
But if I understand you properly, the German public, the majority of the German public, has not yet come to terms with the notion of German soldiers going to other countries and fighting wars. Is that right?
They are struggling with it. They don't want it, as probably in most other countries, because of the number of body bags coming back. And this is also a typical development before. You know, the Germans went into Afghanistan in 2002. And until 2006, there were practically no victims because the Germans played it very safe. But since then, the number of fallen soldiers has augmented dramatically. And so the Germans are getting used with this picture of tin coffins coming back, fallen soldiers, soldiers with wounds and post-traumatic stress disorder and all this. So there is a slow change without enthusiasm, and I think that's good because we do not want the Germans to become militaristic again. But it's a kind of reality check, a wake-up call.
Let me ask you one last thing, Wilfried, and that is, since Canada's engagement in Afghanistan, there has been a real, I think it's fair to say, a real change in the Canadian public in how it regards our armed forces. I mean, for many decades, we saw Canadians as peacekeepers and, as you say, doing the social work of the world. But Canada's role in Afghanistan has changed that, and I think Canadians have a much more resurgent pride in Canada's war-fighting capacity and abilities. And soldiers are heroes across the country now, and when they're introduced at sporting events, they get standing ovations. And, you know, there has been a resurgent pride in the Canadian military. Has that happened in Germany as well?
No, I wouldn't go so far. But I see the same kind of development. What is important now is, in Canada as in Germany, to see that the missions of soldiers comprise both parts. So soldiers are indeed and will always be peacekeepers, but they are also warriors. So it's getting more difficult for the soldiers, and therefore they deserve to really be honored because it's a very difficult job they do.
Wilfried von Bredow, we are grateful that you could spare some time for us. Dankeschön und auf Wiedersehen.
Vielen Dank. Thank you.